An air quality monitor in eastern Washington recorded a reading of 576 this week. The scale it is measured on stops at 500. That same week, forecasters posted heat index values above 110 degrees across 9 states and drew a 4-day severe weather corridor running from the plains into the Great Lakes starting Friday. 3 emergencies, 3 regions, and almost every report you will see treats them as 3 separate stories. They are not. They are one structure, a single enormous ridge of high pressure sitting over the western United States, throwing everything it makes in 3 directions at once. And once you can see how it works, you run into a problem nobody says out loud. Every way out of this pattern makes one of the 3 worse. So which one gives first? If that has your attention, hit the like button and subscribe to the Skylab. Then drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and which of the 3 you're actually in: the heat, the smoke, or the storm corridor. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The Machine Over America. There is one thing sitting over the western United States right now, and it is about to hurt 3 different parts of this country in 3 completely different ways at the same time. That is not a figure of speech. It is the actual physical situation as of Thursday, August 6, 2026. A single structure in the atmosphere, one feature, one enormous dome of high pressure parked over the interior west, is currently generating a record heat build across the Great Plains, an air quality emergency across the Pacific Northwest, and a 4-day corridor of severe thunderstorms that runs from the plains through the Midwest and the Great Lakes and into the Ohio Valley starting tomorrow. Most coverage will treat those as 3 stories. Your local station will do the heat, the national desk will do the fires, the weather channels will do the storms, and every one of those segments will be accurate and every one of them will be missing the thing that actually matters, which is that all 3 of them are the same weather. Let me give you the sequence first because I do not want to make you wait for it. Tomorrow, Friday the 7th, 2 separate pockets of severe thunderstorms are forecast. One of them runs from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan down through central and eastern Iowa into northwestern Illinois. The other one sits on top of one of the most densely populated stretches of ground in North America, the corridor that includes New York City, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C., with a projected peak wind gust of 70 miles per hour. Saturday night, the threat moves and it changes character. Thunderstorms capable of producing damaging winds are forecast to extend from western Nebraska, across northern Kansas, through northern and central Missouri, across much of Iowa, and into west-central Illinois. That is a line roughly 800 miles long, and the reason forecasters are describing it the way they are is that storms in that specific configuration have a habit of organizing themselves into a single self-sustaining system that travels through the night. Sunday and Sunday night, a similar threat is expected to develop, but farther north, over the plains and the upper Midwest. And Monday, the 10th, the pattern holds, and one forecast discussion circulating this week flagged a particularly intense pocket of strong mid-level winds sitting directly over Wisconsin and Michigan on that day, with the blunt assessment that if storms manage to fire in that environment, the result could easily be very significant. 4 days, 4 separate rounds, in August. Now hold that in your mind because at the exact same time that this is happening, the National Weather Service has already posted heat products with start times attached to the weekend. An extreme heat watch is in effect for northeast Kansas and northwest Missouri, valid from Saturday afternoon straight through Tuesday evening, with heat index values that could exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit at times. A heat advisory covers southeast Nebraska from Saturday at noon through Monday night at 10. Across a broader region, heat index values in the range of 110 to 117 degrees have been forecast for parts of Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, Missouri, Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, and Oklahoma. And while that's happening, in the Pacific Northwest there are 49 uncontained large wildfires burning in Washington and Oregon alone. The city of Spokane recorded a local air quality index reading that spiked as high as 576, and the professional forecast for that region says there is no significant rain expected for the next 7 to 10 days. 3 emergencies, 1 structure. So let me tell you what the structure is, because once you can see it, the rest of this stops being a list of disasters and starts being a single argument. A heat dome is not a temperature. It is a shape. It is a tall column of air running from near the ground up through most of the depth of the atmosphere in which the air is sinking. Sinking air compresses as it descends into the higher pressure near the surface, and compressed air warms. That is not a metaphor, and it is not complicated. Take any gas, squeeze it, and it gets hotter. The atmosphere does this on a continental scale every summer, and when the column is large enough and stubborn enough, we give it a name. The important part is what sinking air does to clouds. It destroys them. Sinking air is drying air, and drying air cannot hold a cloud together. So underneath a heat dome, the sky goes clear, and a clear sky means the ground absorbs the full load of August sunlight with nothing in the way. The ground heats, the air above the ground heats, and warmer air expands, which pushes the pressure surfaces higher, which strengthens the ridge, which increases the sinking, which clears more sky. That is a feedback loop that feeds itself. It is why these things do not simply blow over after a few days, and it is why the question this channel asked back on July 25th, when we looked at the dome sitting over the southwest and wondered out loud what happens if it does not die down soon, has now been answered in the least comforting way available. It did not die down. It got bigger. As of this week, that dome has expanded into the Rockies, and forecasters are now describing it moving east, so that by next week it is projected to stretch from New Mexico, Texas and Louisiana, all the way north to Montana, the Dakotas, Minnesota and part of Wisconsin. That is not a heat wave in a region. That is a structure the size of a large fraction of a continent relocating. Here is where it stops being a heat story. Everything I just described applies to the inside of the dome. The clear sky, the sinking air, the compression heating, the stagnation. But the atmosphere is not a wall with a door. The dome has an edge, and the edge is where the interesting violence lives. Air in the upper atmosphere does not stop when it encounters a ridge of high pressure. It goes around it, and specifically, it goes over the top of it. Picture a river that meets a boulder. The water does not vanish. It accelerates around the obstruction, and downstream of the obstruction it comes back down. The atmosphere does exactly this on the scale of a continent. Fast winds several miles above the surface ride up and over the northern flank of the ridge, accelerate as they go, and then descend on the far side, moving from the northwest toward the southeast. Meteorologists call the result northwest flow, and northwest flow, in the second week of August, over a boundary layer that has been marinating in Gulf moisture for weeks, is one of the most productive severe weather setups in the entire climatology of the United States. That is the machine. The heat is the inside of it. The smoke is what the inside of it does to a region that is already on fire, and the storms are what happens on the rim. There is one more piece, and it is the piece that turns this from a pattern into a sequence with dates attached. Right now, there is a large area of low pressure sitting well to the north, up over Canada. That low is not going anywhere quickly, and its circulation is what keeps the northwest flow established rather than transient. It acts like an anchor on the northern end of the conveyor belt. As long as it sits there, disturbances keep getting fed into the flow along the ridge's northern edge, and each one of those disturbances is a candidate to become a storm system when it arrives over the heat and the moisture waiting downstream. So when a forecaster says the pattern is going to be active from Friday through Monday, what they are actually saying is that the anchor is holding and the conveyor belt is loaded. I want to be honest with you about something before we go any further, because it is going to matter enormously by the time we reach the end of this. Forecasters are right now more confident about what happens over 4 days than they are about what happens in any single one of those days. That sounds backwards. It is not. The large-scale pattern is a physical structure that models handle well, and there is broad agreement that the environment across the northern tier will support organised severe storms from Friday through at least Monday. But the question of which county gets hit, and at what hour, and whether Saturday produces one long destructive complex or 3 disorganised clusters that fall apart after sunset, depends on small disturbances that the models genuinely cannot resolve 4 days out. Right now, guidance is split on whether surface low actually sets up over the weekend. One solution parks it over Nebraska, which would drag the severe threat down toward Iowa and Nebraska. Another keeps the focus farther north over the upper Midwest. Those 2 outcomes put the danger in different states. That gap between knowing the machine and not knowing its products is the reason this video exists. Because there is a version of this weekend where very little happens in any given town and people conclude the whole thing was overhyped. and there is a version where a single overnight system runs 800 miles and takes the power out from Nebraska to Illinois. Both of those outcomes are consistent with the forecast that has been issued. What I can tell you with certainty is the thing that does not depend on any of that uncertainty. All three of these hazards are outputs of one structure, which means they are not independent, which means, and this is the part almost nobody says out loud, the conditions that would relieve any one of them are the conditions that make at least one of the others worse. There is no version of the next 10 days in which America gets to feel better everywhere at once. I am going to prove that to you, and I am going to do it with the actual numbers, because the proof is not in the fear, it is in the geometry. But first we need to go up to where the winds run 5 or 6 miles above the ground, where the ridge meets the flow, because everything that is about to happen on the ground between Friday and Monday is decided up there, in a place none of us can see, by a mechanism that most people have never had explained to them. And the strangest part of that mechanism is this: the hotter the dome gets, the more dangerous its own edge becomes. Part 2. The Wall and the River. 5 miles above Kansas, there is a river of air moving fast enough that a commercial jet flying into it loses roughly 100 miles an hour of ground speed, and nobody on board notices anything except that the flight is long. That river is where this whole thing gets decided. To understand why the rim of a heat dome is dangerous, you have to stop thinking about the atmosphere as weather and start thinking about it as a fluid with an obstacle in it. That is genuinely all a ridge of high pressure is, from the perspective of the winds aloft. It is a bulge. It is a place where the surfaces of constant pressure, the invisible layers that the upper atmosphere is organized into, have been pushed upward by all that warm, expanded air underneath. When flow encounters that bulge, it has to go somewhere. It cannot go through it. It goes over it and around its northern shoulder and then back down the other side. And in the process, 3 things happen that matter enormously to anyone standing on the ground 1,000 miles downstream. The first is acceleration. When a fluid has to move around an obstruction, the streamlines get squeezed together, and squeezed streamlines mean faster flow. This is the same principle that makes a river run quicker through a narrow gorge than across a wide flat bed. So the winds along the northern rim of a strong ridge are not just present, they are enhanced, and the stronger the ridge, the more pronounced the squeeze. The second is orientation. Because the flow is coming over the top of the ridge and descending on its eastern flank, its direction over the region downstream is from the northwest toward the southeast. That is the entire origin of the phrase northwest flow, and it is not a trivial detail, because the direction of the wind several miles up determines the direction that any storm which forms down below is going to travel. The third is the conveyor. Embedded in that flow are disturbances, small waves, kinks in the wind field, a few hundred miles across, that carry with them a subtle region of rising motion. On their own they are nothing. You could not photograph one. On a satellite loop they show up, if you know what to look for, as an area of slightly increased cloud that most people would scroll past. But when one of those disturbances arrives over a place where the ground is 95 degrees and the air near the surface is loaded with moisture that has been pumped north out of the Gulf for a week, the disturbance stops being nothing. It becomes the trigger. Here is what I mean by loaded. Instability, in the way meteorologists use the word, is stored energy. It is the amount of work the atmosphere would do on a parcel of air if that parcel could get started rising. The measurement gets expressed in joules per kilogram, and the numbers themselves are less useful to you than the mental picture, which is this. Imagine a lid. Underneath the lid, hot moist air is piling up, gaining energy, wanting badly to rise and unable to. The lid is a warm layer a mile or 2 up, capping everything below it. On most August days in the plains, that lid holds. That is why you can have a day that is 98 degrees and swampy and utterly cloudless, and nothing happens, and everyone goes to bed. The energy was there. Nothing broke the seal. A disturbance riding through on northwest flow is what breaks the seal. It provides a nudge of lift across a broad area, and once a few parcels punch through the cap, the stored energy takes over, and the thing goes vertical in a hurry. Updrafts in a well-fed summer storm can exceed 100 miles per hour straight up, and that is happening inside a cloud that may reach 50,000 feet. Now, the storm exists. But a storm existing is not what makes a 4-day corridor dangerous. Individual storms are common. What makes this pattern different is what the wind profile does to those storms after they form. This is the part that separates a normal August afternoon from the setup we are looking at over the next several days, and it is the reason I keep returning to the ridge, because the ridge is what supplies the wind profile. When the winds aloft are weak, which is the ordinary late summer situation, a thunderstorm rises straight up, dumps its rain down through its own updraft, chokes itself, and dies in 45 minutes. That is a pulse storm. It might drop a severe wind gust as it collapses. Mostly it is a loud inconvenience. When the winds aloft are strong, which is what northwest flow provides, the storm gets tilted. The rain falls out downwind of the updraft instead of into it. The updraft survives, and a storm that does not strangle itself can keep going for hours. That is the whole difference. Not more heat, not more moisture, geometry. And once storms are surviving instead of collapsing, they start doing something that turns a scattered afternoon into a regional event. They start cooperating. When a thunderstorm rains, the falling precipitation drags cool air down with it. That cool air hits the ground and spreads out in every direction, and along its leading edge it acts like a miniature cold front, shoveling the warm, humid air ahead of it upward, which builds a new storm, which produces its own pool of cool air, which merges with the first one. Do that enough times and the individual storms stop being individual. You get a single organized system, dozens of miles across with one continuous leading edge, feeding on the warm air it keeps lifting in front of itself, propagating forward at 40 or 50 miles an hour with a mass of cold air underneath it acting as its engine. Meteorologists call that a mesoscale convective system, and in the Midwest, riding northwest flow, at the height of summer, it is the single most reliable producer of widespread wind damage in the entire country. There is one more ingredient that turns these systems from an evening problem into an overnight one, and it is the reason the professional forecast for this weekend keeps specifying Saturday night and Sunday night rather than Saturday and Sunday. After the sun goes down, the ground cools and the layer of air right at the surface stops mixing with the layer above it. Friction, which had been dragging on the wind all day, effectively switches off a few hundred feet up, and the wind in that shallow layer, released from the drag, accelerates. On summer nights over the plains, this produces a ribbon of fast, moist air running north at 2,000 or 3,000 feet, a feature meteorologists have been tracking since the middle of the last century, and one that peaks in the hours after midnight. That ribbon is a fuel line. It carries Gulf moisture directly into the leading edge of an existing storm complex at exactly the time of night when everything else is shutting down. Which is why these systems do not politely fade at sunset the way an ordinary afternoon storm does. They intensify. They are being fed. That is the mechanism behind the geography in this weekend's forecast. Damaging wind potential, extending from western Nebraska, across northern Kansas, through northern and central Missouri, across much of Iowa, into west-central Illinois on Saturday night. That is not a random collection of states. That is the shape of the ribbon, and the storms are going to walk along it in the dark at 40 or 50 miles an hour, arriving over each town that is asleep already at full organization. I want to be precise about the hazard here, because this is where public intuition and physical reality separate. When most people hear that a severe weather threat is coming, they picture a tornado. Tornadoes are what the coverage is built around. They are the image that survives in memory. But the defining danger of a northwest flow regime is not the tornado. It is the straight-line wind. A mature system of the kind I just described can lay down a swath of damaging wind hundreds of miles long and 50 miles wide. Not a track, a swath. Everything under it gets the same wind, at close to the same time, and the wind comes from one direction and does not rotate. Trees come down in parallel. Roofs fail on one side of the street. Power lines go across a whole region, rather than a neighborhood. When that swath becomes continuous over a distance of several hundred miles, the event gets a specific name. It is called a derecho, from the Spanish word for straight, and the Midwest is the most favored region on Earth for producing them. Late summer northwest flow is their preferred habitat. That is what forecasters mean when they use the phrase long-lived thunderstorm complexes, capable of producing widespread damaging winds, which is the exact language in this week's professional forecast for Saturday night and Sunday. It is careful language. It is not a prediction that a derecho will occur. It is a statement that the environment is one in which that outcome is on the table, which is a genuinely different claim, and one that deserves to be understood correctly rather than either dismissed or catastrophized. So now put the pieces back together, because they only make sense assembled. The ridge supplies the heat, which supplies the instability. The ridge supplies the obstruction, which supplies the accelerated northwest flow, which supplies the wind profile that lets storms survive and organise. The Canadian low anchors the pattern so that this does not last one afternoon but 4 days. And the moisture streaming north on the ridge's western flank, all that Gulf air being drawn up into the plains ahead of the heat, is the fuel. Every single ingredient traces back to the same structure, which raises a question that I think is the most interesting thing in this entire forecast, and one that almost never gets asked in a weather segment, because the answer runs against the way we instinctively think about heat and storms as opposites. If the ridge is what causes the storms on its edge, then what happens when the ridge gets stronger? The intuitive answer is that stronger high pressure means more suppression, more sinking air, fewer storms, and inside the dome that is exactly right. But on the rim, the opposite is true, and the reason why is going to reframe how you look at every heat wave for the rest of your life. Part 3. Why August is not supposed to look like this. Ask any meteorologist when severe weather season is in the United States, and you will get an answer that does not include the second week of August. The answer is spring, April, May, into June. That is when the outbreaks happen, that is when the tornado counts spike, and that is when the country pays attention. By the time you reach the middle of summer, the severe weather map goes quiet in a way that is not an accident and not coincidence. It is structural. Here is why. The engine that drives spring severe weather is contrast. Specifically, the contrast between the cold air still sitting over the northern part of the continent after winter and the warm, humid air surging north out of the Gulf. That temperature difference is what powers the jet stream, because the jet stream is fundamentally a response to a temperature gradient. Sharpen the gradient, and the jet strengthens. Strengthen the jet, and you get powerful winds aloft over ground that is already growing unstable at the surface. That combination, strong winds several miles up over hot, humid air below, is the recipe. It produces the organisation and the rotation and the longevity that turn a thunderstorm into an event. Now watch what happens as summer arrives. The northern half of the continent warms up. The cold reservoir drains away. The temperature contrast between north and south collapses, and the jet stream, having lost the gradient that powered it, weakens and retreats northward into Canada. The instability does not go away. If anything, it increases, because July and August are the hottest and most humid months of the year, and the surface is loaded with more energy than at any other point on the calendar. But the winds aloft are gone, and without the winds aloft you get the pulse storm situation I described a moment ago. Enormous energy, no organisation, storms that go up, rain themselves out, and collapse. That is the normal August. Big loud thunderstorms in the afternoon, an isolated damaging wind report here and there, and nothing that a state emergency manager loses sleep over. Which brings us to the thing that makes this particular week worth an entire video. The pattern we are watching restores the missing ingredient, and it does it through a completely different route than the one spring uses. The strong winds arriving over the Midwest between Friday and Monday are not coming from a seasonal jet stream, because the seasonal jet stream is not there. They are coming from the interaction between a large area of low pressure sitting over Canada and the enormous ridge sitting over the western United States. The low provides a source of cool air and a circulation. The ridge provides the obstruction that accelerates the flow around it. And between those two features, in the gap along the northern edge of the dome, you get a corridor of mid-level wind that would be entirely unremarkable in April, and is genuinely unusual in the second week of August. So the atmosphere over the northern tier of the country right now is running a combination that does not normally coexist. August-grade instability underneath spring-grade steering flow. That is the anomaly. Not the heat, which is impressive but not unprecedented. Not the fires, which are severe but which follow a known seasonal curve. The anomaly is the calendar mismatch, and it is why a professional forecast this week is describing 4 consecutive days with severe potential rather than one Wednesday afternoon. And here is the piece I promised you at the end of the last section, which I think is the single most counterintuitive fact in this entire situation. The stronger the heat dome becomes, the more violent its own edge gets. That sounds wrong. High pressure suppresses storms. Everyone knows this. When the ridge is overhead, you get blue sky and misery, not thunder. and that is completely true inside the dome. But consider what a strong ridge does to its own boundary. The dome is a region of thick, warm air. The territory just north of it, being fed by the Canadian low, is a region of relatively cool air. The strength of a ridge is a measure of how warm and how tall that column is. So the hotter and stronger the dome becomes, the greater the difference between the air inside it and the air just outside it. And a temperature difference over a horizontal distance is precisely what generates wind aloft. That is the same relationship that powers the jet stream in spring, applied at a smaller scale to the rim of a ridge instead of to the whole hemisphere. So a strengthening dome does not merely coexist with the storms on its northern flank. It sharpens the gradient that makes those storms possible. It manufactures the contrast that its own edge then converts into wind. Sit with that for a second, because it reverses the ordinary way we think about a heat wave. We treat the heat as the disaster and the eventual storm as the relief. In a pattern like this one, the heat is not the disaster that gets relieved. The heat is what is building the weapon. There is a second consequence that follows directly from that, and it explains a detail in this week's forecast that would otherwise look like a contradiction. Earlier this week, while the southwest was baking and the plains were heating up, parts of Minnesota and the upper Midwest were sitting in overnight lows in the 50s and low 60s. In the first week of August, people were reporting genuinely cold conditions on lakes in northern Minnesota, with wind coming off the water in the middle of what national coverage was correctly describing as a heat emergency in other regions. Those two facts are not in tension, they are the same system. The Canadian low that delivered that cool air is the identical feature that will supply the steering flow for the weekend storms. The pleasant Tuesday and the dangerous Saturday are one weather system observed at two stages of its life. I find that genuinely unsettling in a way that has nothing to do with fear. It is the recognition that the most agreeable weather of the summer, in a specific place, was the leading indicator of the most dangerous weather of the month in that same place. Now let me put the honest caveat on all of this, because I promised you the geometry and not the fear, and part of the geometry is the uncertainty. Everything I have described so far is pattern scale reasoning. It is high confidence. The ridge is measured. The Canadian low is measured, the northwest flow is measured, and the instability is measured. When forecasters say the environment across the northern tier will support organised severe storms Friday through Monday, they are making a claim about a physical configuration that is directly observable and well modelled. What they are not claiming, and what nobody can claim 4 days out, is which counties get hit. The reason is that the trigger, that small embedded disturbance I described riding through on the flow, is exactly the scale of feature that models struggle with. A shift of 150 miles in where a disturbance arrives, or a shift of 4 hours in when it arrives, is the difference between storms firing in the late afternoon over hot destabilized ground and storms firing at 10 at night over a stabilizing one. That is the difference between a serious event and a nothing. Right now, the guidance for the weekend is genuinely split. One family of solutions puts the surface low over Nebraska, which would pull the Sunday severe threat southwest into Iowa and Nebraska. Another keeps the emphasis farther north across the upper Midwest. Both are physically reasonable. Both are supported by real models run by serious people. They resolve in the forecast cycles between now and Saturday morning, and not before. If you want a demonstration of how wide that uncertainty actually runs, look at what happened with rainfall over Chicago in the middle of this week. A flash flooding corridor set up from Kansas City northeast toward Chicago, and forecasters flagged a slight risk of excessive rainfall across it. Across northern Missouri and Iowa, guidance indicated isolated totals of 5 to 6 inches over a 48-hour window, with widespread amounts of half an inch or more likely across the whole risk area. Serious, well-handled, and it verified in the general sense. But for Chicago specifically, the models disagreed with each other so completely that they were not describing the same day. Several high-resolution models showed the city picking up almost nothing at all. Another model showed upwards of 2 inches. Same city, same 24 hours, same physics. Two forecasts that a person planning their week could not possibly reconcile. That is not incompetence. That is the honest resolution limit of the science on a day when the outcome depends on where individual storm clusters set up, and it is a preview of exactly the problem forecasters face this weekend on a much larger and much more dangerous scale. It is also worth noting what today itself looks like, because today is the disorganized version of the thing that is coming. Thursday's severe threat sits in a pocket running from central and southern Kansas and northern Oklahoma into central and southern Missouri and northern Arkansas, with flash flooding, locally damaging wind gusts, and a few storms carrying hail large enough to damage maturing crops. That is a real threat, and people in those areas should treat it as one. But it is scattered. It is the August default. The difference between that and Saturday night is the wind profile, and the wind profile is being delivered by the ridge. I'm telling you this because I think the honest version is more useful than the confident version, and because the alternative, which is the standard practice of stating the most dramatic possible outcome without the caveat, is the reason people stop believing forecasts at all. So here is where we stand at the end of the first act of this thing. There is a machine. We can see it. It is expanding, and it is beginning to move east. Its rim is loaded, and the loading is scheduled to start producing tomorrow and to continue through Monday. Its interior is doing something entirely different and equally serious to two other regions. Tomorrow is the first test, and tomorrow is unusual on its own terms, because the ridge is about to produce severe weather in two places separated by 1,000 miles on the same afternoon for two completely different reasons. Part 4. Friday in two places at once. Tomorrow afternoon, two separate corridors of severe thunderstorms are expected to develop about 1,000 miles apart, and both of them are being produced by the same ridge, for two entirely different reasons. Start with the western one, because it is the one that belongs to the story we have been building. From the upper peninsula of Michigan, southwest through central and eastern Iowa, into part of northwestern Illinois, forecasters have drawn a corridor of severe thunderstorm potential for Friday afternoon and evening. The threats named are flash flooding and damaging wind gusts, with hail large enough to damage crops in localized areas. Look at the orientation of that corridor. Upper Michigan to Iowa, that is a northwest to southeast line, and it is drawn that way because it is following the flow. It is the first visible product of the conveyor belt we spent the last section building. A disturbance arrives on the rim of the ridge, encounters the hot, moist air that has been accumulating underneath, and the storms that result travel along the same axis that delivered them. This is the opening act. It is not the main event, and forecasters are not describing it as one. What it does is establish that the machine is producing, and it puts the first stress on ground that is going to receive several more rounds over the following 3 days. That last point deserves more attention than it usually gets. Flash flooding is not a per-storm hazard. It is a cumulative one. The first round of heavy rain across eastern Iowa does not simply drain away and reset the clock. It saturates soil, fills the small drainages, and raises the level at which the next round becomes dangerous. So a corridor that sees Friday afternoon storms, and then Saturday night storms, and then Sunday storms, is not experiencing 3 separate events. It is experiencing one escalating one, in which each round arrives on ground that is less able to absorb it than the round before. That is the quiet mechanism by which multi-day patterns kill people, not the strongest storm, the third storm on saturated ground. There is one detail in Friday's Midwest forecast that sounds minor and is not, and it is the hail. Forecasters have specified hail large enough to damage crops in localized areas, which is a different threshold than hail large enough to damage a roof. Agricultural hail damage begins at sizes that would barely register as a news event in a city, and in the second week of August, corn across eastern Iowa and northwestern Illinois is at or near full height, carrying its full weight, with the ear already formed. Hail at that stage does not simply bruise a plant, it shreds leaf area, which is the machinery the plant uses to fill the grain, and it does that at the exact point in the season when there is no time left to regrow it. A field hit in May recovers. A field hit in August does not. So the same 20 minutes of storm that produces an inconvenience in a town produces, in the field on the edge of that town, a loss that cannot be undone until next year. Now the eastern corridor, which is a different animal entirely. On Friday afternoon and evening, a second area of severe thunderstorms is forecast across the Interstate 95 corridor, covering New York City, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. The primary dangers named are flash flooding and damaging wind gusts, with a projected peak gust of 70 miles per hour. Take a moment on the population figure implied by that list, because it changes what the same wind speed means. Those 4 metropolitan areas together hold something on the order of 30 million people, living in dense infrastructure, much of it old, much of it with power distribution above ground, threaded through a mature tree canopy that has spent the summer growing heavy with leaves. A 70-mile-per-hour gust over open farmland is a bad afternoon. The same gust over an urban forest with a 100-year-old street grid underneath it is thousands of individual failures happening at once. It is worth walking through what actually happens physically when a wind field like that crosses a major eastern city, because the chain is longer than most people picture, and almost none of it is dramatic on its own. The first thing to fail is not a building, it is a tree limb. August foliage is the heaviest of the year, and a mature street tree carrying a full canopy presents an enormous surface area to a horizontal gust. Soil in these corridors has also been repeatedly wetted by the summer's storms, which loosens root plates. So limbs come down, and in the worst cases, whole trees tip. The second thing to fail is the wire the limb lands on. Most residential distribution in the older eastern cities runs overhead, threaded directly through that canopy. One limb takes out one circuit, which is a few hundred customers. 1,000 limbs across 4 metropolitan areas in the same 90 minutes is a regional outage, and crews cannot begin restoration until the wind stops and the trees are cleared, which means the outage that starts at 6 in the evening is still there at breakfast. The third thing to fail is drainage. These storms are being described with flash flooding as a co-equal threat to the wind, and urban flash flooding does not need a river. It needs pavement. Water that would soak into farmland in Iowa has nowhere to go in Philadelphia except into the storm system, and when rainfall rate exceeds what the inlets can swallow, the water goes to the lowest point available, which is very often an underpass, a stairwell, or a basement apartment. And this is not the Northwest Flow corridor. This eastern threat is being generated on a different part of the pattern entirely. High pressure has been building along the east coast, and moisture wrapping around it has kept the entire eastern seaboard steamy. The storms there are firing along weak boundaries at the edge of that high, and the fuel is the humidity. The forecaster language on this is unusually direct. The chief on-air meteorologist for one major national forecasting operation put it this way: the steamy air sticking around will help provide fuel for the storms. Weak fronts and the edges of high pressure will help focus the storms, allowing some to become severe or produce torrential downpours. Notice what is doing the work in that sentence. Not a cold front, not an approaching system, the edges of high pressure. The storms in the east this week are being organised by the boundary of a fair weather feature, which is a strange sentence to write and an accurate one. So on Friday, the same overall configuration produces severe weather in the upper Midwest through the mechanism of accelerated northwest flow, and severe weather in the mid-Atlantic through the mechanism of moisture piling up against the edge of a coastal high. 2 different physical routes, one pattern, and there is a third one, and it is the strangest of the 3. Also on Friday afternoon and evening, across parts of Arizona and New Mexico, storms are expected to develop with a heightened risk of flash flooding and damaging wind gusts, with a projected peak gust of 85 miles per hour. 85. That is 15 miles per hour stronger than the projection for the DC corridor, in a region most Americans associate with cloudless sky. Those are monsoon storms, and they behave in a way that is genuinely different from anything in the eastern half of the country. They form fast during the heat of the afternoon over terrain, and many of them produce very little rain at ground level because the air underneath them is so dry that the rain evaporates on the way down. But evaporation cools the air it falls through, and cooled air is dense, and dense air accelerates downward. So what reaches the surface is not water. It is a column of cold air hitting the ground at speed and blasting outward in every direction. That is a downburst, and in the desert it is the main event rather than a side effect. And when that outflow races across terrain that has been baking for months, it lifts the surface with it. Dust, sand, dried soil, thousands of feet into the air in an advancing wall that can be visible from 30 miles away, and that reduces visibility on a highway to nothing in about 4 seconds. The word for it, borrowed from Arabic and used in the American Southwest since the 1970s, is haboob, and it is one of the few weather phenomena in this country that reliably kills people on interstates rather than in buildings. A senior meteorologist working this forecast described the mechanism plainly. Where little rain occurs, or before the onset of downpours, gusty winds can raise large dust storms that disrupt travel. He then noted that the Phoenix area had already experienced a dust storm on Wednesday night, while sitting on the edge of a thunderstorm. On the edge. Again. Everything in this pattern is happening on an edge. which is the point I want to land before we get to the weekend, because it is the structural claim of this entire video, and Friday is the cleanest demonstration of it we're going to get. On one single afternoon, a ridge of high pressure over the western United States is going to generate damaging thunderstorms in the upper Midwest, damaging thunderstorms in the mid-Atlantic, and 85-mile-per-hour dust storms in the desert Southwest. 3 regions, 3 mechanisms, 1 feature, and in between all of them, in the interior of the dome, absolutely nothing will be happening at all, except that it will be brutally hot and the air will be unbreathable. That is what a mature blocking pattern does. It pushes all of its energy to its own perimeter and leaves its centre still. There is a way to see this that I think makes it stick. Imagine dropping a heavy stone into shallow water. The place where the stone landed goes quiet almost immediately. Everything that happens afterward happens in rings, moving outward, at the boundary between the disturbance and the water that has not been reached yet. The dome is the stone. It has been sitting there for weeks, and the entire drama of the next 5 days is going to unfold on its rings. Friday's the first ring, it is scattered, it is multi-regional, and by the standards of what follows it is manageable. Saturday is when the pattern stops producing storms and starts producing a system. Part 5. The thing that travels in the dark. The most dangerous 4 hours of this entire pattern will probably happen while most of the people in its path are asleep. Saturday night. That is the window forecasters have flagged, and the geography they have drawn for it runs from western Nebraska across northern Kansas, through northern and central Missouri, across much of Iowa, and into west-central Illinois. Trace that on a map and you're looking at a corridor roughly 800 miles long, covering a substantial fraction of the American agricultural heartland, and containing a list of cities that includes Omaha, Des Moines, Kansas City, Lincoln, Topeka, Columbia, Peoria, and 100 smaller towns that will never be named in a national forecast. The professional language for what may happen there is long-lived thunderstorm complexes capable of producing widespread damaging winds. I want to unpack every word in that phrase, because it has been chosen with real care, and because the difference between what it says and what people hear is where the risk actually lives. Long-lived, ordinary summer thunderstorms last under an hour. A system of the type being described here can persist for 8, 10, 12 hours and can travel from western Nebraska to Illinois within one night. Longevity is the whole hazard. A storm that lasts an hour affects one county. A storm that lasts 10 hours affects 5 states. Complexes, not a storm. A merged assembly of storms functioning as one organism, with a single continuous leading edge, sharing one cold pool underneath. Once that consolidation happens, the system stops depending on the individual updrafts that built it. It generates its own lift continuously along its forward boundary. It becomes self-sustaining, which is a phrase that should give you pause when applied to something 40,000 feet tall. Widespread damaging winds, not a tornado, not a hail core, a swath. Everything under the leading edge gets hit by roughly the same wind from roughly the same direction within a few minutes of each other, and the damage pattern that results looks nothing like a tornado track. Trees fall in parallel lines pointing the same way for 50 miles. Centre pivot irrigation systems fold. Grain bins peel. Power distribution fails not at one substation, but across a whole region simultaneously, which is why restoration after these events is measured in days rather than hours, and capable of producing. That is the honest hedge, and it belongs there. Nobody is promising this happens. The claim is that the environment permits it. So what does the environment need to permit it, and why does Saturday night look the way it does? 3 things have to line up, and by Saturday evening all 3 are forecast to be present at once. The first is instability, which by Saturday will be substantial and rising, because the heat build across the plains is exactly what supplies it. That is the same heat that has an extreme heat watch attached to it. The energy that will be feeding the storms and the energy that will be endangering people in Kansas City are literally the same energy. The second is the wind profile delivered by the ridge, which we have already established. The third is the nocturnal fuel line, that ribbon of fast moist air that develops after sunset over the plains and runs north at a couple thousand feet, peaking in the hours after midnight. It carries Gulf moisture directly into whatever is waiting for it. Put those 3 together and you get a system that arrives at each successive town more organized than it was at the last one, in the middle of the night, when nobody is watching a radar. Which brings me to the part of this that I think is genuinely underappreciated by almost everyone outside the field. Overnight, severe weather is disproportionately deadly, and the reason is not meteorological, it is behavioral. Studies of tornado fatalities in the United States have found that events occurring at night are substantially more lethal than daytime events with comparable intensity, and the mechanisms are the ones you would guess. People are asleep. Sirens do not wake people inside a house with the window shut and an air conditioner running. Phone alerts get silenced at bedtime by people who did not know they would need them, and nobody looks out a window at 2 a.m. and sees a wall of cloud approaching because there is nothing to see. A nocturnal complex removes every layer of human backup that daytime severe weather leaves intact. The visual warning is gone. The social warning, the neighbour who calls, the coworker who mentions it is gone. What remains is whatever technology you set up before you went to bed. So if you live anywhere along the corridor I named, that is the practical thing to take from this entire video. Not fear. A setting on a phone. There is a second reason overnight events run up the damage totals, and it is about what happens the morning after rather than during. Power restoration after a wide swath of wind damage is not limited by the number of crews, it is limited by access. Utility crews cannot begin work on a line until the tree that fell on it has been cut and cleared, and tree clearing cannot begin until roads are passable. So the sequence is roads first, then trees, then wires, and each stage waits on the one before it. When that damage is concentrated in a single town, mutual aid works. Crews come in from surrounding regions and the job is done in a day or two. When the damage is distributed along an 800-mile swath, every surrounding region is also damaged, and there is nowhere for the mutual aid to come from. That is the specific reason restoration after these events is measured in days rather than hours, and why the outage map on the second morning often looks worse than it did on the first, as assessments come in from places nobody had reached yet, and that outage lands, in this particular pattern, on households that are simultaneously under a heat product. Now let me talk about the ceiling on this, because when a system of this type becomes sufficiently long-lived and lays down a continuous swath of wind damage over several hundred miles, it stops being a thunderstorm complex and becomes a named phenomenon. It is called a derecho. The word comes from the Spanish for straight, and it was chosen deliberately, more than a century ago, to distinguish this kind of straight-line destruction from the rotational destruction of a tornado. The Midwest is the most favoured region on Earth for producing them, and the late summer northwest flow regime is their preferred habitat, which is to say, precisely the configuration that is forecast to be in place from Friday through Monday. There is a shape these systems take when they reach that stage, and once you know it, you can recognise it on any radar image for the rest of your life. The leading edge stops being a straight line and starts to bulge forward in the middle. On radar, it looks like an archer's bow, and that is exactly what it gets called. A bow echo. The bulge forms because the cold air pooling underneath the system is not spreading evenly. It surges, and where it surges hardest, the storms get pushed out ahead of the rest of the line. Behind the apex of that bow, air from the rear of the system descends and accelerates forward, driving into the back of the cold pool and reinforcing the surge. That descending current has a name too, the rear inflow jet, and it is the specific feature responsible for the worst surface winds in these events, because it takes momentum from several miles up and delivers it to the ground. Once a bow echo has developed a strong rear inflow jet, the system becomes largely self-reinforcing. The jet strengthens the cold pool strengthens the lifting along the leading edge, the lifting builds more storms, and the new storms feed the jet. That loop is what allows a complex to cross 5 states without weakening. It is also why the warning lead time on these events is so short. A tornado warning is issued on a rotation signature that can be identified while the storm is still some distance away. A damaging wind swath from a bow echo arrives as a wall, moving at highway speed, and the practical warning for any given town is often measured in a small number of minutes. I want to be careful here. No forecaster has predicted a derecho this weekend. Predicting one specifically, days in advance, is not currently possible. What is possible, and what has been done, is to identify that the pattern is one in which that outcome is available, and to say so in language that does not overclaim. But you should understand what the outcome would mean if it happened, because that is the difference between a forecast being informative and being noise. A mature derecho does not behave like a storm passing through. It behaves like a front of wind moving at highway speed with no weakening for hours. Wind gusts across large areas in the range of 70 to 100 miles per hour, sustained over minutes rather than seconds, arriving with almost no lead time because the system is moving faster than most people's mental model of weather allows for. The damage totals in past events of this class have run into the billions of dollars across single nights, and the power outages have run into the millions of customers. And here is the thing that makes it a specifically August problem in the agricultural Midwest. Corn at this point in the season is at or near full height and carrying its full weight. A wind field of that magnitude does not damage a corn crop the way hail does by shredding it. It flattens it in one direction, across entire counties, and much of what is flattened cannot be harvested by machine afterward. So the same wind that takes down a power line in a town takes out a year of work in the field next to it. That is Saturday night's ceiling, not its forecast, its ceiling. The forecast, honestly stated, is this. The environment will support organized complexes capable of widespread wind damage across a corridor from western Nebraska to west central Illinois, most likely after dark, with the specific track and intensity depending on where a surface low sets up and where a disturbance arrives, neither of which is currently resolvable, which means Saturday night is a coin that is going to be flipped whether anyone watches it or not. And Sunday, the coin gets flipped again, farther north, over ground that will already have taken one hit. Part 6. Sunday, Monday, and the pocket over Wisconsin. By Sunday morning, whatever happened overnight will already be a known quantity, and the pattern will not care. The forecast for Sunday and Sunday night is a similar threat developing farther to the north, over the plains in the upper Midwest. Same mechanism, shifted geography, and a critical difference, which is that Sunday's storms will be arriving over ground that has already absorbed whatever fell on it the night before. This is where the cumulative problem I mentioned earlier stops being theoretical. Soil has a finite capacity to take water in, and once the upper layer is saturated, additional rain does not infiltrate at all. It runs off, which means the second night of a multi-night pattern produces more flooding from less rain than the first night did, and the third night produces more still. And the flooding hazard from a second night is not just larger, it is faster. A small creek in Iowa or northern Missouri responds to rainfall on a timescale of hours when the ground is dry, because the soil buffers the input and releases it slowly. Saturate that soil and the buffer disappears. The same 2 inches of rain that produced a gradual rise on Friday produces a wall on Sunday, because effectively all of it arrives at the channel at once. That is the mechanism behind a statistic that surprises people every time it comes up. Most flood deaths in the United States happen in vehicles, not in homes, not on riverbanks, in cars, at night, on rural roads, when a driver encounters water across a low crossing that was completely dry when they drove the same route that morning and cannot judge its depth in the dark. 2 feet of moving water will float most passenger vehicles. A foot will do it to many of them, and a road that has been crossed 10,000 times without incident offers no signal at all that tonight is the night it is under 4 feet of moving water. So the second and third nights of a pattern like this carry a specific and preventable danger, and it is not the wind. I also want to put an honest marker down here, because this channel covered a very similar setup less than a month ago, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Back on July 13th, we looked at a pattern flip that established northwest flow across the eastern 2/3 of the country, and we walked through what that regime produces. Some of what was forecast in that window verified impressively, some of it did not. Specific days that looked dangerous 4 days out ended up disorganized, and other days that looked marginal produced more than expected. That is the honest track record of multi-day severe forecasting, and it is the reason I keep hammering on the difference between the pattern and the day. The pattern call in July was correct. The day-by-day placement inside it was, in places, wrong. There is no reason to expect this weekend to behave differently, which is precisely why the useful posture is preparation rather than either panic or dismissal. The uncertainty on Sunday is the largest of any day in this sequence, and it comes down to a single unresolved question that I keep coming back to because everything downstream of it depends on the answer. Where does the surface low set up? One family of model solutions places it over Nebraska. If that verifies, the severe threat on Sunday gets pulled southwest, centering on Iowa and Nebraska, and the upper Midwest gets a comparatively quiet day. Another family keeps the focus farther north, across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the upper Great Lakes, which would put the danger over a completely different set of communities. Those are not small differences in emphasis, they are different states, and as of this recording, the models genuinely disagree, and there is no honest way to tell you which one is right. That resolves in the forecast cycles between Saturday morning and Sunday morning, and anyone who tells you otherwise right now is guessing with confidence rather than knowledge. What I can tell you is that both solutions keep the fundamental structure intact. The ridge is still there, the Canadian low is still there, the northwest flow is still there. The disagreement is about where inside the corridor the trigger arrives, not about whether the corridor exists. Then comes Monday, and Monday is the day with the highest ceiling in the whole sequence. One forecast discussion circulating publicly this week highlighted something specific in the model guidance for Monday the 10th. Not a general area of risk, a pocket. An unusually intense concentration of strong mid-level winds, positioned directly over Wisconsin and Michigan, with the assessment that if severe weather were to develop in that setup, it could easily be very significant. I want to handle this carefully, because a flag like that is exactly the kind of detail that gets stripped of its qualifiers as it travels. That is a model-derived observation about a wind field 4 days out. It is not a forecast of an outbreak. Wind fields that intense at that range routinely weaken, shift several hundred miles, or arrive at the wrong time of day to matter. The thing that makes a strong wind field dangerous is its coincidence with instability during the afternoon heating cycle, and that coincidence is exactly what cannot be predicted at 4 days. But it is also not nothing, and here is why it deserves to be on your radar rather than dismissed. I said earlier that the reason August is normally quiet is that the winds aloft have gone. A pocket of strong mid-level flow over Wisconsin and Michigan in the second week of August is the missing ingredient showing up in the 1 month it is not supposed to. If it arrives over an air mass that has spent the previous days heating and moistening, which is precisely what the rest of this pattern is arranging, then the thing that has been absent from the late summer atmosphere is present at the moment the atmosphere is most loaded. That is the whole reason forecasters flagged it. Not because the number is enormous in absolute terms, but because of when and where it is. And there is a specific reason Wisconsin and Michigan on a Monday in August is a phrase worth paying attention to. Those states sit at the downstream end of the corridor. By Monday, if the pattern behaves as forecast, systems will have been running along that axis for 3 consecutive nights. The atmosphere downstream will be primed, and the lakes themselves are part of the reason. In August, the Great Lakes are near their annual maximum temperature, which means a system crossing them is not moving over a cold surface that saps its energy. It is moving over warm water that adds moisture to the boundary layer underneath it. In late autumn, a storm crossing those lakes is fighting the surface. In August, it is being fed by it, so Monday is the day to watch. Not because it is the most likely to produce an event, but because it has the highest ceiling if it does, and because by then the ground and the air will both have been prepared by everything that came before. Beyond Monday, the honest answer collapses into uncertainty. Tuesday looks active in a general sense. Further rounds of showers and thunderstorms are expected into the middle of next week. Where any of it sets up is unknown. What is known is the large-scale evolution, and that is where this begins to fold back into the other 2/3 of the story. Because next week, the ridge moves. The forecast for the coming week has the heat dome extending from New Mexico, Texas, and Louisiana north and east to Montana, the Dakotas, Minnesota, and part of Wisconsin, with the intensity easing along the Pacific coast states. Read that geography again, and notice what it does to the corridor we have spent this entire act discussing. Minnesota and Wisconsin, which are the northern end of this weekend's severe axis, are on the list of places the dome is expanding into, which means that the same region that spends the weekend under a storm conveyor spends the following week under the ridge itself. That is not relief. That is a substitution. The storms stop because the lid comes down, and when the lid comes down, the temperatures go up, and the air stops moving. And that is the transition I want to make now, because we have spent the first half of this video on the rim of the machine, watching what it throws off its edge. The rim is loud. The rim is what makes the news and what produces the footage and what people photograph from their porches. The interior is quieter, and over the course of a week it is more dangerous. Inside the dome, right now, there are 2 entirely different emergencies running in parallel. One of them is a number, and it is going to exceed 110 degrees across a region containing several million people, starting Saturday afternoon. The other one is invisible, It is being measured in a city in eastern Washington at a level that is literally off the published scale, and it is not going to improve for at least a week, because the same physics that produced it prevents it from clearing. Both of them are the direct product of the structure whose edge we have been watching. Let us go inside. Part 7. 110 degrees and rising. There is a specific reason the National Weather Service stopped talking about temperature and started talking about heat index, and this weekend in Kansas is going to demonstrate it. Here are the products that are already posted, with start times attached, as of Thursday the 6th. An extreme heat watch covers northeast Kansas and northwest Missouri, valid from Saturday afternoon through Tuesday evening, with heat index values that could exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit at times during that period. A heat advisory covers southeast Nebraska from Saturday at noon through Monday night at 10, with heat index values up to 109, and across a broader footprint, heat index values in the range of 110 to 117 degrees have been forecast for portions of Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, Missouri, Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, and Oklahoma. 9 states, 4 days minimum, and every one of those numbers is a heat index rather than an air temperature, which is the detail that matters most and gets explained least. Your body does not cool itself by radiating heat away. At the temperatures we are discussing, the air is warmer than your skin, so radiation and conduction are working against you rather than for you. The only cooling mechanism you have left is evaporation. You sweat. The sweat evaporates, and the phase change from liquid to vapor carries energy away from your skin. That mechanism depends entirely on the air being able to accept the water vapor, and air that is already close to saturated cannot accept much more. So the heat index is not a comfort scale invented by a network to make a number sound scarier. It is an estimate of the physiological load, combining temperature with humidity to describe what the body actually experiences. 95 degrees at 20% humidity and 95 degrees at 70% humidity are not the same event. One of them your body handles, the other one over hours it does not. And this specific pattern is a humidity pattern. That is the part I want you to hold on to, because it connects directly back to everything we discussed in the first half. Strong southerly flow on the western flank of the expanding ridge has been pumping moisture north into the plains for days. That moisture is the fuel for the storms on the rim. It is also the reason the heat index in Kansas is going to run 20 degrees above the air temperature. Same water vapor, 2 different weapons. Now let me talk about the part of heat that kills, because it is not the afternoon. The afternoon is what everyone photographs: a thermometer reading, a bank sign, a shot of a downtown sidewalk. But the human body handles a hot afternoon relatively well if it gets to recover afterward. Core temperature comes back down overnight, the cardiovascular system unloads, and you start the next day roughly where you started the last one. Heat becomes lethal when the recovery does not happen. Under a strong ridge with high humidity, overnight low temperatures stop falling. The moisture in the air acts as a blanket, radiating heat back down toward the surface and preventing the usual nighttime cooling. So instead of dropping into the 60s, the low drops into the high 70s or the 80s, and a person without air conditioning wakes up having never cooled off. Their core temperature starts the second day elevated, and the third day starts higher than the second. That is a cumulative physiological debt, and it compounds. It is the reason a 4-day heat event is not 4 times as dangerous as a 1-day event. It is dramatically more than that, in a non-linear way, and it is why the duration attached to these products, Saturday afternoon through Tuesday evening, matters more than the peak number does. The demographics of who dies in these events are consistent and depressing. Older adults, whose thermoregulation is less efficient and who are more likely to be on medications that impair sweating or fluid balance. People living alone. People without functioning air conditioning, or with air conditioning they cannot afford to run. Outdoor workers who cannot simply decide not to be outside. And people with existing cardiovascular or respiratory conditions for whom the additional load on the heart is the thing that tips a stable condition into an emergency. Heat is consistently among the deadliest weather hazards in the United States, and it accomplishes that without producing a single dramatic image. There is no footage of a heat wave. There is only a number on a screen, and weeks later a mortality statistic that most people never see. There is also a vocabulary problem buried in these products that trips almost everyone, and it is worth 30 seconds because it changes what you do when you see one. A watch means conditions are favourable for the hazard, but the details are not locked in yet. It is a heads-up issued early, and it is the product you plan around. A warning, or in the heat products an extreme heat warning, means the hazard is expected or occurring, and it is the product you act on. An advisory sits below that, describing conditions that are dangerous but generally less severe than warning criteria. So what northeast Kansas and northwest Missouri have right now is a watch, which means the forecast office believes the criteria are likely to be met but is not yet committing to them, and which means there is a very real chance that product gets upgraded to a warning before Saturday afternoon. Southeast Nebraska has an advisory, also potentially upgradable. The reason I flag this is that people frequently read a watch as a weaker version of a warning, as though the danger was smaller. It is not a statement about the size of the danger. It is a statement about the forecaster's confidence, issued early precisely so that you have time to make arrangements while the outcome is still uncertain. And then there is the piece where this section reconnects to everything in the first half of this video, which is the electrical grid. Demand for electricity in a region under this kind of heat peaks in the late afternoon and holds into the evening, as air conditioning runs continuously and residential load stacks on top of commercial load that has not yet gone home. That is the daily maximum stress point on the system, and utilities plan for it. What they cannot plan for is that same evening being the moment a line of thunderstorms with damaging winds arrives from the northwest. That is the compound scenario sitting inside this forecast, and nobody has to invent it to describe it. The heat is forecast across Kansas, Missouri and Nebraska starting Saturday afternoon. The overnight severe complex is forecast across northern Kansas and northern and central Missouri Saturday night. Those are the same states, in the same 12-hour window. A household that loses power at 9 at night during an extreme heat event is not inconvenienced. It is in a home whose interior temperature begins climbing immediately, on a night when the outdoor low is not going to provide relief, with no functioning cooling and, if the outage is regional, no obvious place nearby to go. That is the mechanism by which two separate hazards from the same structure multiply each other rather than adding. Now I want to close the loop on something, because there was a figure circulating in forecast discussion this week that I want to handle honestly rather than repeat for effect. One publicly circulating discussion suggested central Kansas reaching around 105 degrees on Friday, and locations in the Central Plains approaching 115 degrees on Saturday, naming Kearney, Nebraska specifically. That figure got attention, as a figure like that will. Here is the honest treatment. That discussion did not make it clear whether it was describing air temperature or heat index, and those are very different claims. 115 degrees as an air temperature in Nebraska in August would be genuinely extraordinary. 115 as a heat index in that region during a humid ridge is serious, dangerous, and entirely consistent with the official products. The load-bearing numbers in this video are the official ones. Extreme Heat Watch, Northeast Kansas and Northwest Missouri. Heat Index over 110 Saturday through Tuesday. Heat Advisory, Southeast Nebraska, up to 109 Saturday through Monday night. Those are the figures with a public agency's name attached to them, and a defined methodology behind them, and those are the ones you should act on. I bring the discrepancy up rather than quietly dropping it because I think you are entitled to know when the sources disagree. A number that sounds more alarming is not automatically the more accurate one, and a channel that only ever reports the highest figure available is not informing you, it is entertaining you. So here is the situation in the interior of the dome on the eastern side. Several million people, across 9 states, are going to spend 4 to 5 consecutive days in conditions where the body's only remaining cooling mechanism is being partially disabled by humidity, with overnight recovery suppressed, in a region where the storms that would normally break the heat are being channeled around the northern edge of the very structure causing it. That last clause is the one I want you to sit with. The thunderstorms that would ordinarily cool the plains are not absent. They are being routed. They are running along the rim, hundreds of miles north, doing damage in Iowa and Illinois, while the ground underneath the dome stays cloudless and the temperature keeps climbing. The relief is real, and it is happening to somebody else, and it is arriving as a disaster when it gets there. And that arrangement is about to change, because the dome is not staying where it is. Next week it moves, and when it moves it is going to take the 100-degree readings into places that have spent this entire week enjoying the coolest weather of their summer. Part 8. The dome is moving. Phoenix hit 115 degrees on August 2nd, and that was not the number that should have alarmed anyone. The number that should have alarmed people was 94. That was the low. The coolest the air got in a metropolitan area of nearly 5 million people on the night of a record-breaking day. 94 degrees at the bottom of the diurnal cycle. That is what a mature heat dome does. It does not just raise the ceiling, it raises the floor, and the floor is where survival is decided. Before we follow this structure east, I want to establish what it did on its way here, because the scale of what has already happened is the best available evidence for what it is capable of doing next. Through the final days of July and into the first days of August, this dome delivered a record-challenging stretch across the western United States. Dozens of daily records were challenged across at least 12 states. At the peak, roughly 50 million people were under some form of heat alert. Nearly 12 million people were under a level 4 of 4 extreme heat risk on the first weekend of August, with another 20 million at level 3 of 4, described as major. Billings, Montana, was forecast to reach 106 degrees, which would challenge its all-time August record. Death Valley was forecast to reach 126, and Phoenix broke its August 2nd record at 115, with that record warm low of 94. Those are the credentials of the structure we have been discussing. This is not a garden variety summer ridge. It is one of the strongest features of its kind this year. It has been in place for weeks, and everything happening on its rim is being generated by that strength. That level 4 of 4 designation deserves a moment, because it is a relatively recent tool and most people have never had it explained. It comes from a scale that grades heat not by temperature alone, but by how unusual the heat is for that specific location and that specific time of year, how long it is expected to last, and whether there is overnight relief. Level 1 is minor, Level 2 is moderate, Level 3 is major, meaning the heat affects anyone without effective cooling or adequate hydration. Level 4 is extreme, and the definition attached to it is blunt. It describes rare, long-duration heat with little to no overnight relief, affecting anyone without effective cooling, and it explicitly flags impacts to health systems and infrastructure. 12 million people were in that category on a single weekend. The reason the scale grades by local unusualness, rather than by an absolute number, is that 105 degrees in Phoenix and 105 degrees in Seattle are completely different emergencies. Phoenix is built for it. The housing stock has air conditioning, the population has behavioral adaptations, the medical system has seen it before. In a city where that temperature arrives once a decade, the same reading produces mass casualties because none of that infrastructure exists, which is exactly why Billings, Montana forecast of 106 and challenging an all-time August record, is a more meaningful data point than Death Valley forecast to 126. Death Valley at 126 is Death Valley being Death Valley. Billings at 106 is a city built for a different climate being asked to operate in one it was not designed for. Now watch what it does next. The forecast for the coming week has this dome extending from New Mexico, Texas, and Louisiana in the south, north, and east to Montana, the Dakotas, Minnesota, and part of Wisconsin, with some easing of the heat in the Pacific Coast states. Read that list slowly because it contains a genuine reversal. Minnesota, Wisconsin. Those are the two states that spent the early part of this week under the coolest air in the country, with overnight lows in the 50s and low 60s in the first week of August, on lakes where people were reporting that it felt like autumn. Those are also the two states sitting at the northern end of this weekend's severe weather corridor, and next week they are on the list of places the heat dome expands into. So the sequence for one specific region runs like this: unseasonably cool early in the week, a multi-day severe weather corridor over the weekend, potentially including an overnight complex capable of widespread wind damage, and then, immediately behind it, the dome itself arriving with the heat. 3 completely different hazard regimes in 8 days, in the same place, all of them produced by the same interacting features. Meanwhile, on the far side of the country, the Pacific Coast states get some easing, and I want to be precise about what that word means, because easing is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and it is going to matter enormously in the next section. Easing means the heat backs off somewhat. It does not mean the pattern breaks. It does not mean rain. The professional forecast for the Northwest, issued this week, states plainly that no significant rain is expected in that region for the next 7 to 10 days. So the region with 49 uncontained large fires burning in it gets slightly lower temperatures and no water. There is a version of this pattern shift that reads, in a headline, as good news for the West. It is not. It is a redistribution. There is a specific reason a record warm low is the number professionals look at first, and it is worth understanding because it applies to every heat event you will ever hear about. During the day, the surface absorbs energy faster than it can shed it. At night, the process reverses. The ground radiates infrared energy upward, the surface cools, and the air in contact with it cools too. That nighttime shedding is the atmosphere's reset, and it is the only reason a multi-day heat event is survivable at all. 3 things can jam it. Humidity, which absorbs outgoing infrared and radiates part of it straight back down. A layer of warm air aloft, which is exactly what a heat dome is. And thermal mass at the surface, which in a city means concrete and asphalt that spent the day absorbing energy and spend the night releasing it. Phoenix on August 2nd had all 3, which is how you get a low of 94, and the practical consequence is not abstract. A body under heat stress does its repair work overnight. Core temperature drops, the cardiovascular system stops working overtime, and sleep, which is itself thermally regulated, becomes possible. Remove the overnight drop and none of that happens, and the person who was merely uncomfortable on day 1 is in physiological trouble by day 3 without anything dramatic having occurred in between. That is the shape of the danger sliding east right now. Let me explain the mechanism by which a dome relocates, because it clarifies why this is a shift rather than a breakdown. A ridge does not move like a car. It moves the way a bulge moves in a rope, which is to say the material stays roughly where it is while the shape propagates. What actually happens is that the upper level wave pattern across the hemisphere shifts, and the position of maximum ridging translates east, while the trough downstream of it also translates east. The consequence is that everything organised around the ridge moves too. The northwest flow corridor on its northern rim shifts. The zone of maximum subsidence shifts. The moisture channel on its western flank shifts. So the entire arrangement we have been describing, the machine and all of its outputs, slides east across the continent over the course of about a week. Which is why the same forecast that has the dome expanding into the northern plains and upper Midwest also notes something about the west that deserves its own sentence. The shifting dome, according to that same outlook, may bring sporadic showers to the west, but it could also lead to an uptick in winds and lightning strikes that could ignite new wildfires or fan existing ones. Hold on to that, because it is the exact moment where the closed nature of this system becomes visible. The Pacific Northwest right now has 2 problems. Its air is unbreathable because nothing is moving, and its fires are burning because there is no water. The pattern change that arrives next week begins to address the first problem by introducing some circulation, and it addresses the second problem not at all because sporadic showers over terrain at this dryness level evaporate before they matter. And the circulation that starts to clear the air is delivered by wind and by thunderstorms, and wind and thunderstorms are precisely the 2 things that start and spread fires. So the relief mechanism and the ignition mechanism are the same mechanism. I said at the beginning of this video that every path out of this pattern trades one disaster for another, and that I would prove it with the geometry rather than with fear. This is the first half of the proof. The dome moving east relieves the Pacific Coast heat, worsens the plains and upper Midwest heat, and reintroduces the ignition risk to a region carrying 49 uncontained large fires. There is no configuration in that list where 3 regions improve. The second half of the proof is inside the smoke, and it is stranger than this one because in the northwest right now the atmosphere is doing something that looks like mercy and functions like a trap. Part 9. The air that will not move. There is a number out of eastern Washington this week that should not be possible, in the strict sense that it exceeds the scale it is measured on. Spokane recorded a local air quality index reading that spiked as high as 576. The air quality index tops out on the standard published scale at 500. The hazardous category, the worst one, begins at 301. So a reading of 576 is not merely bad air, it is a value that ran off the end of the chart that exists to describe it in an American city of roughly 250,000 people. That is what the interior of a heat dome does to a region that is already burning. Let me lay out the fire situation first, with the actual national figures, because the scale of it has not registered with most of the country. As of August 3rd, according to the National Interagency Fire Center, wildfires had burned 5.2 million acres across the United States so far this year. The 10-year average for this point on the calendar is 3.8 million acres, so the country is running at roughly 137% of normal. Oregon alone accounts for more than 2 million of those acres. One state, holding close to 2/5 of the entire national total. Washington and Utah have each burned nearly 500,000 acres, and as of August 6th there are 49 uncontained large fires burning in Washington and Oregon. 49, not 49 fires, 49 large fires that are not contained. 2 days ago on this channel we looked at one of them in detail, the Sinlahekin fire in Okanogan County, Washington, which at that point stood at 102,934 acres and 5% containment, and which was the least contained megafire in the country. The argument that video made was that containment percentage is a number the public reads as a progress bar when it is nothing of the sort. Here is what has happened since. The Sinlahekin has grown past 120,000 acres, and its containment has risen to roughly 20%. Both numbers went up. Containment quadrupled, the fire got substantially bigger. Roughly 1,900 personnel are assigned, and it is now 11 days since the fire was discovered on July 26th. If you want a single demonstration that containment does not measure what people think it measures, that is it. Containment describes completed control line. It says how much of the perimeter crews have secured. It says nothing about whether the unsecured part is running. A fire can quadruple its containment while adding 20,000 acres, because those two statements are about different parts of the same fire. I will also flag something small and honest, which is that the reported acreage for the Sinlahekin on August 6th differs depending on which source you check, ranging from roughly 120,692 to roughly 126,168. That spread is not sloppiness. It is what happens when a fire is growing faster than the reporting cycle can update, and the disagreement itself tells you something about the situation. Then there is Spokane. 3 major fires in the Spokane area have forced tens of thousands of people to evacuate and have destroyed hundreds of structures, with the building count reported by August 6th at approximately 850. Thousands of residents remained evacuated as of Thursday. One publication covering the event described it as an urban firestorm, which is a specific and deliberate phrase and an appropriate one, because what happened in those neighborhoods was not a forest fire that reached a town. It was fire behavior sustaining itself on the built environment. Aerial imagery of the same neighborhoods before and after has been published, and it does the thing that statistics cannot. Street grids intact, foundations visible, everything above the foundations gone, in rows. And a man has been charged with arson in connection with one of the Spokane area fires. I'm going to come back to that, because it matters more than it first appears, and not in the way you would expect. Now, the smoke. On the morning of August 2nd, satellite observation showed smoke from the eastern Washington and North Idaho fires pouring east-northeast across Washington and into Idaho, Montana, and several Canadian provinces. The Washington State Department of Ecology reported unhealthy to very unhealthy air across many parts of the state, with more areas expected to be affected through the week. But the transport is not the story this week. The trapping is. Here is the mechanism, and it is the direct counterpart to everything we discussed about the rim of the dome. Normally the air near the ground is warmer than the air above it. That arrangement is unstable, in the useful sense. Warm air at the bottom wants to rise. Cool air at the top wants to sink, and the atmosphere mixes vertically. Anything released at the surface, including smoke, gets carried upward and diluted through a layer that may be a mile or two thick. Under a strong ridge, that arrangement inverts. At night, the ground radiates its heat away to space and the air in contact with it cools rapidly. Meanwhile, a few thousand feet up, the sinking air of the dome is being compressed and warmed. So you end up with cold air at the bottom and warm air on top of it. That is a temperature inversion, and it is a lid. Because rising requires buoyancy, and buoyancy requires being warmer than your surroundings, air at the surface under an inversion simply cannot go up. Vertical mixing stops almost entirely, and smoke released into that layer has nowhere to go. It accumulates through the night and through the early morning in a shallow layer a few hundred feet thick right where people are breathing. A senior meteorologist working this forecast described the setup directly. That same high-pressure area, he said, will lead to increasingly hot conditions with strong late-night and morning temperature inversions, which will trap wildfire smoke close to the ground, leading to widespread poor air quality and greatly reduced visibility. Normally the inversion breaks. The sun comes up, the ground heats, the surface layer warms until it can punch through the cap, and by early afternoon the smoke mixes out into a deeper layer and the readings improve. Except this week there is a complication, and it is the most quietly vicious detail in this entire video. The smoke itself blocks sunlight. A thick smoke layer reflects and absorbs incoming solar radiation before it reaches the ground. Less energy reaches the surface heats less. The mixing that would break the inversion is weaker, and so the smoke stays, which means the shading stays, which means the heating stays suppressed, which means the smoke stays. The pollutant is suppressing the process that would remove the pollutant. That is a self-reinforcing loop running underneath a ridge that is not expected to break, in a region with no significant rain forecast for the next 7 to 10 days. I should say, what is actually in that air, because the number by itself is abstract until you know what it is counting. The pollutant that drives these readings is fine particulate matter, the fraction small enough to be measured at 2.5 microns and below. We covered the transport side of this back on July 15th, when Canadian and Northern Tier smoke was pouring into the Great Lakes in the northeast, so I will not reteach the whole thing here. The short version is that particles at that size are not filtered out by the nose and throat the way larger dust and pollen are. They travel to the deepest part of the lung, and the very smallest of them cross into the bloodstream, which is why the health guidance for a smoke event is not about discomfort. It is about the cardiovascular system. And here is where the smoke problem collides with a heat problem in a way that has no clean solution for the people living inside it. The correct response to hazardous smoke is to stay indoors, keep windows and doors closed, and run filtration. The correct response to dangerous heat is to get into a cooled building, and if you do not have one, to open up and get airflow. Those two sets of advice are compatible if you have air conditioning and a filter. They are directly contradictory if you have neither. A household in eastern Washington this week with no cooling and no filtration is being told, correctly, to seal itself into a hot box, and told, correctly, that the hot box is dangerous. There is no version of that instruction set that works, and it falls hardest on exactly the households least equipped to solve it. There is also a second-order effect that gets almost no coverage, which is what this does to the response itself. Reduced visibility grounds, aircraft, air tankers and helicopters, which are the tools that let a small crew hold a line against a large fire, do not fly into a smoke layer they cannot see through. So the same inversion that concentrates the smoke can, on the worst mornings, take away the aerial resources fighting the fire that is producing it. And the thing that makes this a genuinely hard problem, rather than merely a bad one, is that the obvious wish, the thing everyone in that region wants right now, which is for the wind to pick up and blow all of this away, is the one thing that would make the fires themselves dramatically worse. Which brings us to the strangest arrangement in this entire pattern. Part 10. The mercy that is also a trap. The worst air quality in the Pacific Northwest this season is being produced by the safest fire weather the region has had in weeks. That sentence is not a paradox for effect. It is the literal operating condition, and the same meteorologist who described the inversion trapping the smoke laid the other half out just as plainly. While light winds cause smoke to linger and reduce the visibility, he said, it also greatly reduces the risk of flying embers starting new fires and lowers the potential for chaotic fire behavior. Read that twice. The stagnant air that is poisoning Spokane is the same stagnant air that is preventing the fires around it from doing what fires in that region did 5 days ago. Because wind is not a secondary factor in fire behavior. In the fuels that are carrying most of this season, light grass and cured fine material, rate of spread tracks the wind almost linearly. Double the wind, and you roughly double how fast the fire moves. That is why a fire in those fuels can add tens of thousands of acres in one operational period and then be described as moderating the next morning, without either statement being wrong. The fuel has almost no thermal inertia. It responds to the wind and to nothing else. And wind does something worse than accelerate a fire. It launches pieces of it. 2 days ago on this channel we covered the moment when a firebrand from a fire on the shore of Lake Chelan was carried more than 2 miles across open water and started new fires on the far side, in country so steep that crews arriving by boat could not safely reach them. That is what a wind-driven fire does. It stops respecting boundaries. A lake is not a fire break. A river is not a fire break. A highway is certainly not a fire break. None of that is happening this week, and the reason is the same reason the air is unbreathable, so the region is currently sitting inside a genuine trade. It has the worst air it has had all summer, and simultaneously the lowest probability of catastrophic new fire spread it has had in weeks. And there is no lever available that improves one without degrading the other, because they are the same variable. Now here is the second half of it, and this one is subtler and gets misread constantly. The same meteorologist made a further observation about the days ahead. With the building heat dome and widespread dry air, he noted, there should be little if any thunderstorm activity, so the risk of natural fire starts will be low. And then the consequence. If more fires start, especially away from existing blazes, they will likely be human-caused, whether intentional or not, as there will be plenty of tinder-dry vegetation. That is a statement of arithmetic, and I want to make sure it lands as one, because it is exactly the kind of sentence that gets clipped and repurposed into something it is not. Fires in the American West start in two ways: lightning and people. Lightning comes from thunderstorms. A strong ridge suppresses thunderstorms. Remove the thunderstorms and you have removed essentially the entire natural ignition category, which means that of the fires that do start over the next week, the share attributable to human causes climbs toward 100%, not because more people are starting fires, because lightning has been taken out of the denominator. That is the honest frame, and it is the frame you need in order to think clearly about the arson charge filed in the Spokane event. Arson is real. It is documented every fire season, in every fire-prone state, and someone has been charged in connection with one of these fires. That is a criminal matter, and it will be handled as one. What it is not is evidence of a coordinated campaign, and the meteorological shift toward human-caused ignitions is not corroboration of one. The two facts sit next to each other, and they are not connected. One is a criminal charge in a specific case. The other is a statement about a ratio changing because one of its terms went to zero. Since we are here, let me deal with the other claim that circulates during every one of these events, because it deserves an honest answer rather than a dismissal. The claim is that the fires are being exaggerated, and the evidence offered is usually a satellite map showing very few detections. The factual premise is often true. Satellite hotspot products do routinely show far less activity than the ground situation warrants during events like this one, and we walked through exactly this 2 days ago. The reason is detection physics. Thick smoke attenuates the thermal signal the satellite is looking for. Cloud and smoke screening algorithms filter detections. Satellites pass over on a fixed schedule that may miss the peak burning period entirely. A map showing almost nothing is a map of what the instrument could see, not a map of what is burning. And the independent verification does not require the satellite at all. An air quality index of 576 is a physical instrument at a fixed site measuring particulate matter in the air it is sampling. 850 destroyed buildings is a count made by damage assessment teams walking neighborhoods. Tens of thousands of evacuations are orders issued by named county officials. 49 uncontained large fires is an incident management figure compiled from teams in the field. None of those depend on a satellite seeing anything. There is one more version of this I want to address, and then I will leave the topic alone, because it is the one aimed at the pattern itself. Every time a blocking pattern lasts more than a week or two, the claim appears that it is being engineered, that the dome is being steered, or held in place, or manufactured. The answer is energy accounting, and it is not close. A continental-scale heat dome represents solar energy input on the order of 10 to the 19th joules per day across its footprint. That is a number with 19 zeros after it, and it is the daily budget of the thing you would have to move. Human weather modification capability, at its most developed, means cloud seeding. Cloud seeding introduces particles into clouds that are already there and already precipitating, in order to nudge the efficiency of a process that was going to happen anyway. It cannot create a cloud. It cannot move a ridge. It cannot hold a pressure pattern in place over a third of a continent for a month. The real kernel worth acknowledging, and the reason this idea has traction rather than being dismissed outright, is that cloud seeding programs genuinely exist and are publicly funded in several Western states. People are not imagining the existence of weather modification. They are misjudging its scale by something in the range of 1 trillion-fold. Before we leave the fire side of this, there is one piece of calendar context that changes how you should read every number I have given you. August is the historical peak of the wildfire season for much of the United States and Canada. That is not a vague seasonal impression. It is a documented pattern with 3 specific drivers behind it. Thunderstorms are still active across the west, which supplies lightning. Temperatures are at or near their annual maximum, which drives evaporation out of the fuels, and vegetation has had all of late spring and all of summer to dry out, which means the fuel moisture content is at its yearly minimum, which means the 5.2 million acres already burned is not a season total. It is a season to date, taken at the moment the season is normally accelerating. The long-range team at one major forecasting operation has projected that as many as 8 million acres could burn nationally this year, and they note that the risk is forecast to build in California through the end of summer, with autumn historically the most troublesome period for that state. So far this year, California has burned less than 250,000 acres, with year-end projections running from 500,000 to 750,000. Read those 2 figures against each other. The state that dominates the national conversation about wildfire has, this year, been comparatively quiet, while Oregon alone has burned more than 2 million acres. If your mental map of the American fire season is built on California, it has been pointing at the wrong place all summer. So where does that leave the Northwest at the end of this week? 49 uncontained large fires. A season running at 137% of its 10-year average, with the historical peak of the season still ahead, because August is the peak month for wildfire activity in both the United States and Canada. An air quality reading off the top of the published scale. A stagnant regime that is simultaneously the reason the air is unbreathable and the reason the fires are behaving. No significant rain forecast for 7 to 10 days. And a coming pattern shift that eases the heat and may bring the wind and the lightning back. That is not a situation with an exit. It is a situation with a set of trades. And there is one part of the country this week where the same pattern is doing something genuinely good, which almost nobody's going to report, and which I think is the most useful thing left to look at before we close. Part 11. The one place where it helps. There is a stretch of the American Southeast this week where the exact same pattern that is doing all of this damage is quietly doing something good, and I think it is the most clarifying thing left in this story. As high pressure sits offshore in the western Atlantic, the clockwise circulation around it has been strengthening, and that circulation is pulling moisture inland across the southeast. The result through this weekend is rounds of drenching thunderstorms running from Florida up through Alabama, Georgia, the Carolinas, and eastern Tennessee. Several inches of rain are possible across parts of that region over a 1 to 4 day window, and in parts of Florida and southern Georgia, that rain may ease drought conditions. That is the same machine, the same overall arrangement of ridges and lows that is trapping smoke over Spokane and driving heat index values past 110 in Kansas is, in the southeast, delivering water to ground that needs it. The forecast is careful to note that the same rain could also trigger flash flooding, which is the standard tension in any drought relief event. Dry, hardened ground sheds water rather than absorbing it, so the first heavy rain after a dry spell produces more runoff than the same rain would on moist soil. Relief and hazard arrive in the same storm. There is a reason drought relief is so often reported as unambiguously good news and so often is not, and it comes down to how ground in drought actually receives water. Soil that has been dry for a long time develops a hardened surface layer. Fine particles settle into the pore spaces, organic material dries and shrinks, and the top of the soil profile effectively becomes a shell. Water hitting that shell does not infiltrate at the rate the soil is capable of. It beads and runs, which means the first heavy rain after a dry spell produces disproportionate runoff, and the drought does not begin to break until enough rain has fallen to wet and soften the surface so that later rain can get in. That is the awkward physics of drought relief. The rain you need is delivered in a form that initially behaves like the rain you cannot handle. Several inches over 1 to 4 days across the southeast is, on balance, likely to help. It is also likely to produce flash flooding somewhere in that footprint, and both of those statements will be true in the same counties. But the point I want to make is not about Florida. It is about what the southeast proves. Weather patterns are not moral, they are not punishments, and they are not warnings. They are arrangements of pressure and temperature and moisture that produce whatever outcome the local conditions dictate. The same structure that constitutes an emergency in one place is a rainy weekend in another, and a genuine benefit in a third. And none of those outcomes tell you anything about the intent behind it, because there is no intent behind it. That is worth saying out loud in a video that has spent an hour cataloguing what is going wrong, because catalogues of what is going wrong have a way of implying a story that is not there. Now let me put the last few pieces on the board, the ones that give this pattern its texture. Start with the desert, because the storms there this weekend are going to be the most spectacular and the least covered. Monsoon storms will continue firing across the southwest into the weekend. Many of them will produce very little rain at the surface, because the air beneath them is dry enough to evaporate the rain on its way down, and the evaporation cools that air, and the cooled air accelerates downward. What arrives at the ground is a downburst, and across the open desert a downburst lofts everything loose in its path. That is where the dust walls come from. And on Friday, across parts of Arizona and New Mexico, the forecast carries a heightened risk of flash flooding and damaging wind gusts, with a projected peak gust of 85 miles per hour. Flash flooding and dust storms in the same forecast from the same storms. In the desert, those are not opposites. They are two stages of the same event, and which one you get depends on whether the rain reaches you before the outflow does. And there is a specific geography to desert flash flooding that catches visitors and residents alike, every single year, and it is worth 30 seconds because the mechanism is unlike anything east of the Rockies. In the desert southwest, the drainage network is dry. Arroyos, washes, canyon bottoms. They are dry so consistently that roads cross them at grade, hiking trails follow them, and in places people park in them. And because the ground is hardened and largely bare, infiltration is almost nil. A cloudburst over high terrain does not soak in. Essentially all of it runs off, concentrates into those channels, and travels, which means the water arrives somewhere the rain never fell. A person standing in bright sunshine at the mouth of a canyon can be hit by a wall of water produced by a thunderstorm they never saw over a ridge they cannot see past 20 minutes earlier. The classic warning about desert flooding, that you do not need to be in the storm to be killed by it, is not a figure of speech. It is a description of the drainage. So this weekend, in Arizona and New Mexico, the same storms carry two hazards that most people would consider opposites, and both of them arrive without much warning. Then there is the water in the middle of the country. Earlier this week, from Kansas City northeast toward Chicago, a flash flooding corridor developed with a slight risk of excessive rainfall. Isolated totals of 5 to 6 inches were indicated across northern Missouri and Iowa over a 48-hour window. That water is already on the ground. It is already in the soil profile, and it is the antecedent condition that every round of storms from Friday through Monday is going to land on top of. Then the cool air, which I keep coming back to because I find it the most quietly astonishing detail in this entire pattern. Early this week, across Minnesota and the upper Midwest, overnight lows dropped into the 50s and low 60s in the first week of August, on lakes where people were describing genuinely cold conditions with wind coming off the water. The Canadian low that delivered that air is the same feature supplying the steering flow for this weekend's storms, and the region that enjoyed it is the same region the heat dome is forecast to expand into next week. One system. A pleasant Tuesday, a dangerous Saturday, and a hot Wednesday after that. Same air, 3 costumes. And finally the background, which is not a cause of anything specific this week, and which I want to frame precisely for that reason. The atmosphere over North America is operating on a warmer baseline than it did a few decades ago, and warmer air holds more water vapour. The physical relationship is well established, roughly 7% more moisture capacity per degree Celsius of warming. The ocean state through 2026 has been part of that background as well. Here is the honest framing. None of that caused Saturday night's forecast. Ridges have parked over the west and thrown storms along their northern rims for as long as there has been a North America. What a warmer baseline does is shift the distribution. The same setup in a warmer atmosphere with more available moisture produces somewhat heavier rain and somewhat higher heat index values than the identical setup would have produced in a cooler one. It loads the dice. It does not roll them. I say it that way because both of the common framings are wrong. The framing that says this is all normal and nothing has changed ignores a measurable shift in the background state. And the framing that attributes every individual thunderstorm to it ignores the fact that the thunderstorm mechanism has been running for millions of years and did not require our help. There is one more thing that this time of year does, structurally, and it explains why an early August pattern shift behaves differently from the same shift in May. By the second week of August, the continent has been absorbing energy for 4 months. Soil is warm to depth. Lakes are at their annual maximum. Vegetation has transpired what it is going to transpire, and in the dry half of the country, it has largely stopped. The land surface, in other words, has very little cooling capacity left in it. That matters because a heat dome relocating in May moves onto ground that can partially absorb it. The same dome relocating in August moves onto ground that is already loaded and simply passes the energy straight back into the air above it, which is why the eastward shift forecast for next week is more consequential than the calendar makes it sound. The dome is not arriving over a fresh continent. It is arriving over one that has no reserve left. So that is the full board, a ridge that is expanding and moving east, a Canadian low anchoring a corridor of northwest flow along its northern rim, 4 days of severe potential from the plains to the Great Lakes, heat index values above 110 across 9 states starting Saturday, 49 uncontained large fires and air off the top of the scale in the northwest, dust storms and flash floods in the desert, drought relief and flash flooding in the southeast, and a stretch of unseasonably cool air in Minnesota that turns out to be the leading edge of all of it. Everything on that list traces back to one structure, which means the question that has been sitting underneath this entire video finally has to be answered directly. If all of it comes from one machine, what happens when the machine changes? Part 12. There is no exit that helps everyone. Here is the thing I have been building towards since the first sentence. There is no configuration of the atmosphere available in the next 10 days in which all 3 of these emergencies improve at the same time. Not an unlikely one, not a low probability one. There is not one on the board. Let me walk it because the proof is mechanical and it takes about 90 seconds. Option 1. The ridge breaks down. That is what everyone in the Pacific Northwest wants. Break the ridge and the subsidence stops, the inversion collapses, the air mixes, and Spokane can breathe. It is also the outcome that ends the heat across the plains, because the heat is the ridge. But breaking the ridge means replacing it with a trough, and a trough means wind and instability and thunderstorms across the west. Across 49 uncontained large fires, in fuels at their annual minimum moisture, in the peak month of the fire season. Lightning returns to country where it is currently absent. Wind returns to fires that are currently behaving specifically because there is no wind, and the ember transport that carried a firebrand 2 miles across open water last weekend becomes available again. The forecast even says this out loud. The shifting dome, according to this week's outlook, may bring sporadic showers to the west, but it could also lead to an uptick in winds and lightning strikes that could ignite new wildfires or fan existing ones. Sporadic showers do not put out a 120,000-acre fire. Wind and lightning start new ones. That trade is not close. Option 2. The ridge holds where it is. Then the northwest keeps its stagnation, which keeps its fire behavior calm and its air unbreathable, indefinitely, with no rain in the 7 to 10-day forecast. The plains keep their heat, and the northwest flow corridor on the northern rim keeps delivering rounds of storms into the Midwest every night, on ground that gets more saturated with each one. Option 3, which is the one that is actually forecast. The ridge expands and shifts east. The Pacific coast gets some easing of the heat. That is a genuine improvement, and it should be said. But the dome extends from New Mexico, Texas, and Louisiana, north to Montana, the Dakotas, Minnesota, and part of Wisconsin, which means the heat that has been punishing the interior west arrives over the northern plains and upper Midwest. And the same shift introduces the wind and lightning risk back into the west. So the forecast path relieves one region, worsens 2, and reopens the ignition problem in the region carrying the fires. That is the whole argument. 3 options, and every one of them is a trade. I want to be careful about what I am claiming, because there is a version of this that slides into fatalism, and that is not the point. I am not saying nothing will improve. Things will improve in places over the next 2 weeks, and some of them will improve substantially. What I am saying is narrower, and I think more useful. Because these 3 hazards are outputs of a single structure rather than 3 independent events, they are coupled. Their fates are linked by physics, and when hazards are coupled through a shared cause, you cannot treat them as separate problems with separate solutions, because the variable that fixes one is the variable that governs the others. That is a genuinely different way to look at a forecast, and once you have it, you cannot really go back to watching the weather as a list of unrelated regional segments. And because coupling is an abstract word, let me make it concrete for the 3 regions that are actually in this, since that is the practical content of everything we have covered. If you are in the corridor from Nebraska through Iowa to Illinois, the thing that matters is not the categorical risk level on a map. It is whether your phone will wake you. The dangerous window in this pattern is after dark, the systems travel at highway speed, and the warning lead time on a bow echo is short. Every layer of human backup that daytime severe weather leaves intact is removed at 2 a.m. Charge the phone, leave the emergency alerts enabled, and know where in your house you would go without having to think about it. If you are in the heat footprint across Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, and the states south and east of them, the thing that matters is not Saturday's peak. It is the fact that the product runs through Tuesday evening, that overnight recovery is suppressed, and that the same evening the heat peaks is the evening a storm complex may take the power out. The vulnerability compounds across days, and it concentrates in households that are older, alone, or without functioning cooling. If you're in the Northwest, the thing that matters is that the current calm is not recovery. It is a pause with a cost attached, and the pattern change that clears the air is the same pattern change that returns the wind and the lightning to a region carrying 49 uncontained large fires. 3 regions, 3 completely different practical concerns, one structure generating all of them. Now let me give you the honest state of the science, since I have been promising it all the way through. Forecasters can see this machine with real precision. They can measure the height of the ridge, they can track the Canadian low, they can quantify the instability, and they can tell you with high confidence that the environment across the northern tier will support organised severe storms from Friday through at least Monday. What they cannot do is tell you which town. The trigger, the small embedded disturbance riding the flow, is at the scale where models lose skill. Guidance is split right now on where the weekend surface low sets up, with one solution over Nebraska pulling the Sunday threat toward Iowa and Nebraska, and another keeping the focus over the upper Midwest. That resolves in the Saturday and Sunday morning forecast cycles, which means there is a real possibility that this weekend passes over your specific town without incident, and a real possibility that a single overnight complex runs 800 miles and takes out power from Nebraska to Illinois. Both are consistent with what has been forecast. If that ambiguity makes you want to dismiss the whole thing, I would ask you to consider what a severe weather forecast looks like when it works. It looks like nothing. It looks like a person who charged their phone, kept the alerts on, and slept through a night when the storm went by 50 miles to the north. There is no version of a successful warning that produces a satisfying story. The metrics do not help either, and this is worth one final note because we have hit it twice now. Containment percentage is not a progress bar, and this week the Sinla-Hekin proved it by quadrupling its containment while growing past 120,000 acres. Satellite hotspot maps are not fire maps, they are detection maps, and thick smoke defeats them. And a categorical severe weather risk level is not a prediction about your house. It is a probability of a severe report within 25 miles of a point. Every one of those numbers is read by the public as a scoreboard, and not one of them is 1. So here is where we actually are, on Thursday, August 6th, 2026. One structure over the western United States. 4 days of severe weather potential on its northern rim beginning tomorrow. Heat index values above 110 across 9 states beginning Saturday. 49 uncontained large fires and air quality readings past the end of the published scale on its western side. A national fire year already at 137% of normal with the peak month underway. And a forecast path that moves the whole arrangement east over a continent that has, at this point in the summer, no cool ground left to absorb it. Back on July 25th, we asked on this channel what would happen if the heat dome over the southwest did not die down soon. We did not get an answer to that question. We got the situation the question was about. We can see the machine. We have never been able to see it this well. Every ridge, every low, every disturbance riding the flow, measured and modelled and updated 4 times a day. And we still cannot tell a family in Iowa whether Saturday night is the night. That gap between understanding a system completely and predicting its behaviour specifically is not a gap that better satellites are going to close, it is a property of the atmosphere itself. So the thing I will be watching, and the thing I would tell you to watch, is not the temperature and not the storm reports. It is one number in eastern Washington. If the Sinler-Hawkins containment moves again over the next week, while the winds stay light and no rain falls, then the stagnation that is poisoning that region is genuinely buying something, with the damage it is doing, and the trade is at least a trade. And if it does not move, if 11 days becomes 18, and the number sits at 20% while the fire keeps growing under the calmest fire weather it has had all season, then the most stagnant air in America brought nothing at all. We will know within the week,